Welcome to the Church Solutions Podcast, brought to you by JSL Solutions. The Church Solutions Podcast is designed to help equip you and your church in the use of technology and other tools and services. And now, here are your hosts, Steve Lacy and Phil Thompson.
And welcome again to another edition of the Church Solutions Podcast. My name is Phil Thompson.
And I'm Steve Lacy.
And we're brought to you by JSL Solutions, which brings streaming video to you, streamingchurch.tv, and Church App Live, which is also part of the JSL Solution family. Church App Live is mobile apps. And then there's myflock.com, which is websites, church management,
and that
systems.
sort of thing.
Yeah. And
all right.
Full disclosure, we work for JSL Solutions.
We do.
You actually own it.
That's it.
Full disclosure.
So, what are we doing today?
So, we've had people in the past ask a lot about podcasting. And, you know, obviously we're a church, we are a tech company that works with churches and ministries, but we also help with other things. We provide resources for volunteers and pastors and those things because we've all been in ministry. All of us here at JSL Solutions are involved in ministry. And one of the questions I get asked a lot is, you know, I want to do a podcast. My church wants to do a podcast. How do we do it?
All right.
So we did a podcast maybe a couple years ago with
long enough ago that I don't remember doing it. So
I don't remember. Left a big impression on you. But we actually talked a little bit about the how-tos of podcasting. So if we're on iTunes. If you look at for Church Solutions Podcast on iTunes and scroll down probably a couple years or more, you'll see something about podcasting. And we got into kind of the nuts and bolts. And we can touch on some of that, but we got into like, okay, here's kind of how you do it. Here's what you should have, the microphones and all that.
Right.
So this is a little different today.
Yeah. So this podcast, I mean, one use would be, I just want to make my sermons available and maybe stick them in a podcast that automatically downloads every week.
Yeah.
Or you could go to the route of, I'm going to do just a full-fledged podcast that's not related to my weekend talk.
And that's what this one's
about.
This one's what we're really going to talk a little more about. But yeah, you could certainly take your
kind of like what we're doing now.
Yeah, so. Right. What we've been doing for several years and what lots of people do. Certainly you can take your sermons, the content, make an MP3 file out of it. If you stream it, you can strip it to an MP3 file, or if you just record it, and you can set it up. Like with our company, we provide a media vault, and you can RSS feed, and you can get that loaded up. And we'll cover a little bit of that today, but this is more like in addition to what you do. And so in other words, it's not just a Sunday morning sermon. It might be something different.
This is kind of how would I was to put a podcast together, because podcasts are starting to get more popular.
They are.
What would, how would
we do it?
Yeah, how would you do it? Well, that kind of thing.
Some food for thought. So, as you mentioned, podcasts are very popular. Nearly 1 in 5 U.S. adults have their own podcast. I'm just kidding. But 1 in 5 U.S. adults listen to podcasts, at least on an occasional basis. Now, you listen to a podcast every day, right? Don't you listen to like 5 or 6 every day?
Yeah. So
I don't know how you do that, but haven't figured that out.
It is so easy. So,
okay. So
I've been doing this. I used to have a very long commute to work, and I thought I'm going to die if I spend 40 minutes each way in the car just staring out the window. So I got started doing books on tape, and there was a place that initially I'd go buy books that were on tape, and I'd stick them in my cassette player back in the prehistoric
80s.
days.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and then there was places that came around that had books on tape, and so I became a subscriber to these stores.
Okay.
And then that fell away, and that led to audible.com, listening to books.
Which never goes away, by the way. I keep getting billed by Audible. My credit card keeps getting billed, and it just doesn't go away. We cancel it, and it just sneaks back in somehow. But that's another story for another time. But
anyway, so I started supplementing my books with podcasts a long time ago, a very long time ago.
Sure.
And so, so every day I get new feeds of podcast. Now, I told you I was going to give you a hard time in this thing. So the 1 in 5 U.S. adults, I found that really, really surprising.
Well, you think it's too low or too high?
I think it's way too high.
I don't have the reference to this, but I can look it up and get it back to you. But
maybe I just run in a different crowd.
I don't know.
But, I mean, it depends on if you're younger, if you're under 25, I'd probably say, that's a decent stat, but
I'd have to. I don't have the source
U.S.
here.
adults, I think would just be. I would think you might be able to say nearly 1 in 5 U.S. adults know what a podcast is, rather than listen to it.
Well, we can pause this recording and I can look it up if you want.
No.
I got this off the internet, and we all know that everything on the internet.
It's got to be facts.
It's got to be facts, right?
Yes.
As I say that facetiously. All right. Well, let's move past that. I know you're having a hard time.
I know that it is getting more and more popular, though.
Yeah. So we can agree that it's popular. Maybe not 1 out of 5.
I don't know if that is
you don't think it's popular either?
Oh, I don't think it's popular.
Wow, you're really good. We're not even into this thing, and you're already.
I think it's getting much more popular than it's moved from the 5% to the 12% range or so. But.
All right. Well, I'll look this up, and either I'll edit this podcast and throw it in here.
We can let our listeners look it up. And,
just look it up,
or
folks.
they can be Team Phil, or they can be Team Steve.
Team Steve. Yeah. Let us know which team you're on.
Yes.
All right. So what we want to talk about, and then, regardless or irregardless, depending on your English, let's talk a little bit about format and content today. And we can touch a little bit about some equipment, but we've done all that in the past. So.
Right. So this is, so I'm a pastor of a church, and I want to put a podcast together. How am I going to format this thing?
Yeah, now we're 10 minutes into this. Let's go ahead and talk about that. So there are some things that you should consider if you're going to have your own little personal podcast. We would encourage you to maybe have some kind of an intro, some kind of a show intro, podcast intro, so it's not just you yakking. I mean, we have a guy who used to do voiceovers for me, does the voiceover for this podcast at the beginning, and then we actually have a young man that put together the music for us and recorded the music. You might know him. His name is Chad Lacy.
Yes.
It's your son. But you can also get music. There's music out there for free that you can use. There's sources you can grab, and I wasn't going to talk about this, probably should have, but I don't have references for that. But there is some free music you could use.
You're talking kind of the jingle that people goes, oh, here's the intro music that for the podcast I listen to. A little bit of intro music. Right.
It doesn't have to be long, maybe 30 seconds. Maybe have somebody talk a little bit about what this podcast is. Welcome to the Steve and Phil podcast, where we argue about how popular podcasts really are. Something like that in the intro, and then you can take it from there. So some type of a music intro, and then kind of the format of your podcast. What are you going to do? How long is it going to be? Which we'll get into in a moment.
So you're going over kind of a sample outline for putting a podcast together.
So, in our case, I mean, what we do, we're kind of all over the map. Our only common denominator with this podcast is that, ministry and churches. That's kind of who we deal with our jobs, and that's really what our target audience here in our podcast is, people that are involved in ministries and churches, volunteers, leaders, pastors, those kind of things. So, depending on if you're a listener and you go, I want to do my podcast, you probably should have some kind of a target audience that you're going for.
Oh, definitely.
Not just, hey, here's what I had for lunch. I mean, I guess you could do that, but it's probably not going to have a lot of listeners. I don't know, but I could be wrong. So, all right. So show intro, who you are, what you're going to talk about. First 30 to 60 seconds, intro music we just covered, gets a little bit of a jingle, be consistent with that jingle, because every time somebody hears that jingle, they'll think of you, they'll know. And again, you can get some of those free sources, or if you work with a church, or and you might have your worship leader maybe come up with something, so he doesn't sue you for playing it, So, and then the topic. you should probably have a topic here that you're going to cover, and I would say, well, we're kind of getting ahead of things here, but I would say off the bat, roughly keep your podcast roughly under 30 minutes. That's my preference, and I've got something here, another stat here somewhere, which we'll get to in the notes here, which you'll probably argue with me about, but. There was one source, and I actually have a source for this, Stitcher, which kicked our podcast off for some reason. Stitcher, which is an online radio and podcast site, they said the average listener stays connected for 22 minutes. So that's kind of the attention span, supposedly. TED Talks says this. You've heard of TED Talks, right?
Yes.
So TED Talks, they have an 18-minute maximum because they feel like their viewers can't, or their listeners can't hold their attention more than that. So 30 minutes is maybe stretching it. I do know of some podcasts that go longer than that. Do the ones you listen to go longer?
Well, there's a couple of ways to treat this. I mean, I listen to like news-based ones,
right?
And so they'll do short segments within the podcast that is 25 minutes, 30 minutes long.
So this is news like national news or international
national,
news? Okay.
International,
okay.
local, kind of, and a plug for that source I've really been impressed with is World News Magazine. So
okay.
You should, if you're looking for news from a Christian perspective.
Didn't they have a magazine years ago? Wasn't it News?
They started as
I used to get it.
They started as material for like fifth grade church groups.
Oh,
so it was there was a need for these guys need to know what's going on in the news, and it just has gone from there to. So they have a magazine, and they have what's a very popular, very good podcast. So if you're looking for a good source for the news, I highly recommend these guys.
Oh, all right. What was it again?
World News Group. If you go to wng.org, you can subscribe or just look for World News Group on your podcast feed. So anyway,
sure.
So they'll have a 30-minute program, but it's broken into smaller segments. So that are probably just a few minutes long, and they'll say, "Oh, here's what's going on in law this year," and we're gonna.
Okay, interesting.
And they do some things that anyway. I'm not gonna. I could spend a lot of time talking about how wonderful those guys are, but the 25 minutes, 30 minutes. That's probably an average for the podcasts that I listen to as well. Some of the most popular podcasts typically an hour, and you've heard of Joe Rogan, right? You heard of Joe Rogan? Joe Rogan actually has probably one of the most popular podcasts, and he interviews people for 3 hours. So but he's one of the most popular podcasts out there. So
you lost me at 3 hours.
I know. I was thinking the same thing. I've listened to a few of his because he interviewed some mutual friends of ours that have now become famous. But so I listened to that one, but I haven't listened to the others. But yeah, he talks for 3 hours, and he's entertaining the whole.
Well, that's a key. Is whatever you're going to be talking about, you need to be somewhat entertaining about it.
So these are kind of rules of thumb, but there are people out there breaking the mold.
Yeah, there are. There's always exceptions.
Yes.
I think probably one of the biggest questions people have is, okay, if you're going to if you're a pastor or a leader in your church, or even somebody that's maybe you're just, hey, I've got something to say and I want people to hear about it. So, it's kind of good to have somebody to bounce things off of, kind of like a co-host or what we used to say, a sidekick. It's kind of nice to be able to have somebody else in on the podcast with you when you're recording it. So you don't have to, but I think it's good. I mean, I've done, when you've been out of town or something, I've done a few solo Church Solutions podcasts, but I think it's always good to have somebody else there. It kind of breaks up things a little bit and gives a little bit of variety. So if you're going to do a podcast, I would strongly consider maybe having somebody else with you that can kind of jump in at times and add to it or argue with you about stats, those kind of things. So okay. So that's another thing. The other thing that we use a lot is we use Skype. So when we interview people, we go with Skype because most of the time it works pretty good. As long as the person on the other end has a good internet connection, if they happen to have a good cell phone connection, okay. But my experience with cell phone connections has been kind of bad.
Yeah, it's just funny. This morning I was listening to a world news piece, and they were actually on, I'm sure, Skype to interview their regular guest, and they had a problem halfway through, and they said, "Okay, we've had a problem with the phone. With the line. We're going to the phone." Okay. And it came on a cell phone, and Audible was just noticeably different. I talk to our customers every day, many of them on cell phones, and it's just terrible. Skype, you can get a headset and with a good microphone on each end, and it sounds. I think it typically sounds pretty good.
Usually sounds pretty good. Now we're talking the Audible, Skype Audible. I mean, Skype obviously has video. You could certainly do that, but we generally shut the video off when we're interviewing people because, again, it will use less bandwidth when everybody shuts their video off, and your likelihood of having some weird sounds and noises decreases if you just go with audio. And so we encourage audio. Now, something that we have not done, we kind of do our podcast a little bit on the, I don't know, maybe the dysfunctional side, I don't know. But many people recommend that you record using Skype, and you can get these plugins to record your Skype calls, like for Mac users, which you are a Mac user. There's a thing called Call Recorder that you can get for Skype, and that will record your Skype sessions. It's not free. It's about 15 anywhere from $15 to $30, I guess, depending on what you get. PC users, there's a plugin called Pamela, which apparently is free. So those are a couple options. What we do is we actually have a different computer that we use a Skype call with, and we actually run a cable from the one computer into our little mixer. Right. And then the person on the other end that's somewhere else in the world hears us, which is pretty much ambient sound like a speakerphone. They hear us, using Skype, but on the podcast.
They hear the phone call to them through a different means, but we're recording their audio to the same place that our audio is being recorded to.
That's a good way to say it.
So it's much kind of like, rather than plugging in another microphone, you just plug in let's get the output of this Skype call and push it into our mixer. And
so that's what we do. And so in other words, the person on the other end, if somebody's listening to us in Ohio or talking to us from Ohio, they're going to hear more of an ambient sound like this, like a speakerphone, But on the podcast, that doesn't come off because it's, we're speaking in the mics, it's going into a mixer, and then it's being recorded on the other computer, which most of the time we use Audacity, which is one of your favorites because it's free, it's open source, it's a recorder. Audacity, and I have to admit, for the most part, I like Audacity. So it's free, so you can get it.
Yeah, it's very popular, and very well supported and updated and maintained and all that good stuff.
Yeah, there's other...
And it's free.
NCH, I think you can buy that and do a little more maybe with it. I don't know, but
there's
editing with Audacity.
And depending on what your budget is, there is a recommended set of tools that people say, well, you got to get this microphone and get this Pro Tools editor for $7,000, and they're not quite that much, but
close.
I mean, depends on where you want to go with it, and maybe, like I said, I listen to a bunch of different podcasts, and maybe I just don't have the finest ear, but I think our podcast sounds just as good as any of the others I listen to.
I think, so when it comes to equipment, which we talked about in a podcast a few years ago, you can certainly buy some really good microphones, and they are, it's good to have those. I think the biggest, if you want quality, the biggest deal is you need to pay attention to the details, whoever's mixing and whoever's, like right now, I have a little mixer here that we're using, and I'm trying to keep an eye on your levels and my levels and trying to make sure that they don't peak or that they're very similar. So, there's expensive equipment that we could buy where I could just kind of set it and forget it. And, it would be, there'd be a compressor and there would be different things so that, you could get really excited and, whatever, and the levels would stay consistent, and you can do that. But we don't do that because, quite frankly, we just have better things to spend our money on. And as long as you're paying attention to the details, that's really the bottom line. And so if you set the microphones up and you don't pay attention to how far away you are from your microphone, if you're far away like this and you forget and then you're coming in like, it's just, that's going to be a problem. And there's ways to fix that, through expensive equipment and windscreens, and you could certainly do that, but we just don't do that. So, and I think the microphones we have here are pretty cheap. Remember we had the audio guy, what was his name? He was on a few months ago. We had him, a guest who sells audio and helps churches with audio, and I know that he really looked really kind of visibly ill when he saw our equipment. But that's because he does audio and he's an expert, and we're not.
All right, so
so what are we doing here?
What are we doing next? So
we want to talk to people about how to get on iTunes real quickly.
Not much, but yes, I guess.
Well, just quickly, because iTunes is the mothership, right? I mean, if you want people to get your podcast, you need to put it on iTunes, right?
It's probably the most popular platform. I don't know what the stats are, but iTunes is important. You got to get your stuff on iTunes.
Right. So, so iTunes is something to do. So there are some hoops you have to jump through iTunes. And again, a couple years ago, we talked a little bit about this, but you need to, first of all, create an RSS feed for your podcast. And if you upload your files to different websites and different places, they create that automatically. We do that. myflock.com. If you have a streamingchurch.tv account or Church App Live account or MyFlock, we have
what
that
is
too.
an RSS? Do you know what it
I don't know.
stands
You
for?
tell me what an RSS feed is. You're the expert at that.
I was just going to explain the
rigorous syndrome something. No, go ahead.
It's really simplified syndication. I think is what it is.
Is that what it is? Seriously?
Yes.
I knew syndication was in there, but I didn't realize.
It's really simplified.
Okay.
And it's kind of funny. I mean, there's a couple of techno words that are just super popular and really serious. But they had their acronyms of funny names. PGP is another one. Okay. Do you know what PGP is?
I don't.
You've heard PGP encryption?
I have
PGP.
Actually, yeah.
So that,
pretty good something.
It's
right?
pretty good privacy.
Yeah, there you go. That's pretty funny.
Yeah, and the pretty good became the status quo, the best privacy thing out there. So anyway, RSS was kind of the same way. It was
I knew a musician that had, I think, PGR, pretty good records. I think it might have been Keith Green. I don't remember now. Something like that. Pretty good records. PGR.
All right, so you need an RSS feed, which is...
So you got to have an RSS feed.
That's a computer thing.
Go to different sites to get that. If you have questions, again, we'll help you with that. Then you need to submit your podcast to iTunes. And get ready for this, folks. It's fun. So you got to create an iTunes account. You got to select the whole thing with submit a podcast. And then there's different steps that they want you to go through. You got to enter the feed, your URL feed.
Which is the RSS
feed. Yeah. And, you got to put the information in, the name, author, the description of the podcast.
And most importantly...
Click submit?
No, upload a picture with the right size.
That's right. You got to have the right size, which I don't have on mine, but we do on ours. And that's like, what's the resolution? It's something like the 4,000 by 4,000 or something crazy.
It's really high.
Yeah, it's high resolution or high deal. So iTunes will kind of walk you through most of that. And generally, if you get, as Steve said, if you get the resolution right for your logo, your image, you'll usually hear back from them within a day or two.
Yes.
Yeah, they'll email you.
All the magic stuff put in right, then you'll...
Yeah. Although I had a problem recently with mine because they kept saying that, what was the content was not approved? the profane content.
Explicit
Tag was all mixed up, but we fixed that.
Yeah, so that's how to get in iTunes. So we talked about ideal length already.
Right, yeah.
And so the other thing, what happens is you've got to have a host to host your podcast.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Libsyn's a popular one, but all of them cost money. Yeah. So you need a place to post your podcast. And what happens is, as soon as you post your podcast, then it becomes available to download on people's podcast players.
Yeah, if you've gone through the whole RSS thing and all that.
Yeah, so as soon as you upload, then they get that new episode.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, you got to find, I mean, we do that. We can host myflock.com, but there's other ones out there as well. I think WordPress has some kind of a plugin that you can use to do that with as well. I forget what they call it. So, yeah. So, we're almost out of time, thank God. But let's talk a little bit about when's the best time to post a podcast.
So, I think this is consistent with when's the best time to send a weekly newsletter, right?
Seems that way, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah. So, the jury has returned the verdict and says Tuesdays.
That's Tuesday, yeah. Should we check the reference on that just to make sure
we might? I mean, this is where. And we're going to talk about frequency and that sort of thing too as well. But if you are publishing, this assumes that you're publishing weekly, then Tuesday would be the best day to do it.
Yeah.
So they're saying Tuesday's the publishing day for new music on iTunes, and so they just wanted to sync that up with that.
Yeah.
So if you're one of the podcasts I listen to, most of them, almost all of the ones I listen to, come out daily. So they post them in the middle of the night normally, so that they're there. A lot of people will set their iTunes or their podcast players to download. Mine's set to download like 5 in the morning.
Yeah, but you're talking about these guys that do a daily podcast, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
and these guys have sponsors too that you're listening to.
Yes.
Yeah, they have people
like World News Group. Well, they don't have sponsors; they're a nonprofit. But they when they first got started, they had a weekly podcast. But now, since they're a news group, it's every day. And a lot of them that I listen to are daily. Some of them are weekly, and some are maybe monthly.
I think for the purposes of this particular podcast, of course, we do ours weekly. But for this actual episode, I think if you're just starting out, I would encourage you to go weekly.
And for churches and that sort of thing, weekly, I think, is the right frequency.
I think it is, and I think so. Again, we target churches and ministries, and so those of you who are listening are probably involved in some capacity with your organization, either in a leadership role or a key volunteer role. And I think it's a great tool, podcasting weekly, especially if you're a pastor. It takes a little bit of time, but I think you can get into a rhythm where it won't take that much more time, and I think it's a good way to stay connected to your members and even reach out outside of your church membership to others that might come across your podcast, depending on the topics and stuff that you use. So I think it's a great tool to expand your ministry is what I'm getting at. And I think, once you get the rhythm down as far as, okay, we got to set up equipment and maybe you can even have it set up somewhere specifically.
If you're a church, you're going to have all this stuff, right? You're going to have microphones and that stuff. So computers and internet connections and
like for us, we're pretty mobile, so we set up ours sometimes your place, my place. We're actually at my church today doing this, so we're pretty mobile. It takes us a little bit of time to set up, but if you can set it up where it's semi-permanently, maybe in your office or something, and then you can just walk over to the microphone, turn it on, turn the equipment on, and you're good to go.
Right.
So good way to expand.
And, I know I was listening to the Lifeway Resources. They had a little cart where they had all the equipment on it, and they would just wheel the cart around.
That's true. Yeah, I've seen that happen. Yeah, so you can do that. So, so basically we're done here. But I think it's a good addition to what you're trying to do. So consider it. Put some thought into it. If you have questions about it, you can send us an email, support@streamingchurch.tv. It's one of our domains. And
you can even vote Team Phil or Team Steve there too, right?
Yeah. So let's revisit this tired, worn-out subject. So do nearly 1 in 5 U.S. adults listen to podcasts at least occasionally? yes or no. Tell us what you think.
Yes.
And we'll give you the results here next year sometime. So, all right, we're done. We're out of time. Speaking of out of time, we're under our 30-minute mark, so we got to get out of here.
All right. Sounds good.
Hopefully this has been helpful to some degree. We'd encourage you to keep going at it. All right, so he's Steve Lacy. I'm Phil Thompson. Thanks for listening to the Church Solutions Podcast. We will catch you again next time. Have a good one.